Okay, uh, we're going to be dealing with the third part of our terminology series. This is the topic for today. The subtitle is The Transformations of Meaning, and it's a study of 6 examples, in fact, by myself, Machiavellian Machiavellian. Right. So, in this series, we have explored controversies surrounding certain terms, their application, stroke misapplication, and political and or social manipulations thereof. Words often used in a banal, thoughtless manner with an assumed and assured context like terrorism, for example, which, as we discovered, are heavily disputed, both legally and otherwise, yet bizarrely at odds with their remarkably succinct and neutral dictionary definitions. In today's episode, we examine some words used just as thoughtlessly, but which, unlike the others we looked at, arouse little controversy in daily life due to the obscurity of their historical backgrounds and the widespread acceptance of an agreed meaning that they enjoy. The purpose of this presentation is to show us that even some of the most commonplace negative terms we use merit closer examination, hopefully leading us to question why and how we use them at all in the way we do, and also to wonder at the continuing triumph of their agendas that seem to drive them still. So the first term we have is barbaric. And most of us use the word barbaric or barbarous in a modern context to indicate our horror at and alienation from certain acts or conducts that we disapprove of. Its use asserts a self-justifying binary opposition against the term civilized, a universally positive term that we reserve for ourselves, but that also requires investigation. So we apply the barbarous to mean cruel, savage, warlike, primitive, and usually also to imply stupidity. In the picture opposite, for example, the outlandish Goths are depicted sacking the glory that was Rome in 410 the Common Era, as naked brutes engaged in senseless acts of wanton debauchery and destruction. More recent research, however, argues that the Gothic army did not sack Rome at all, and the occupation was a relatively orderly affair. It also contained, that is, the Gothic army, also contained a lot of Roman defectors. Who were they? And what were their motives? You should look into that. Could most of whatever violence did occur have been the result of the class war within Rome itself? That's a topic for another discussion. Perhaps we should therefore look at the origins of the word and discover its historical context. The original term is Greek, oibabaroi, and translates roughly as those who talk a different language and or who speak Greek badly. In their words, to ethnocentric, educated ancient Greeks sounded like bar, hence the term. It is complicated, however, by the fact that the writings of some of these Greek men of letters also applied the term barbarous to other Greeks, especially if these came from the less civilized or less well-developed parts of Greece and had a divergent dialect, such as the mountainous northwest of Greece or Macedonia. Barbarity was also, and crucially, linked to both slavery and imperialism, and in terminology became a lasting hangover eagerly adopted by their successors, that is, the Greek successors, the Romans. A further complication arises in that although barbarity was condemned and despised in general, there are instances of the barbarians being seen as holders of admirable and virtuous qualities, such as we find sometimes in the writings of Xenophon, Anabasis, or Tacitus, Germania. This statue of a Gaul killing himself and his wife on the left, rather than be captured, was a sort of idealization of what we would frame later as the noble savage. So you can see it's got the heroic qualities that you would normally associate with Greeks. You've got a naked man, but it's not the same image that you would get or normally of a naked barbarian. While the Greeks and Romans were not universally prejudicial and were also conflicted as to who the barbarians really were, the doctrinal Christian world that succeeded it was much less so and more Manichaean in its approach. So much so that it even applied the term barbar or Berber, as it later became known, to an entire race of African people who were decidedly more civilized and more advanced than medieval Christendom, when this was the period when the term was in fact coined. Michel de Montaigne, the late 16th century French philosopher, was the first to invert the negative associations of the word and apply it instead to those who were claiming to be civilized, particularly in the context of the Spanish conquests of the Americas. These ideas later became more developed by writers such as Rousseau and Twain. That's Mark Twain. The problem is, however, that as long as this arbitrary polarity between barbaric and civilized exists, whichever one is seen as good and the other as evil, we degrade our understanding of the world, of ourselves, and our own motives. A knowledge of history is the key to the answers. Over on the right, we can see a contemporary image of North American settlers bringing civilization to the barbarians, meaning the native peoples of North America, in typical form. We move on now to vandal. So whenever we hear or speak the word vandal or vandalism, an immediate negative image is implanted in our brains, creating a picture a bit like the one opposite, or something worse. It implies surly delinquents engaged in damage that is destructive to property. It is implied also that there is no reasoning involved, that people are just doing these things, but not because they're are alienated, deprived, or excluded by society, but because they are ignorant or bad people. This projection has been challenged recently by a growing acceptance of graffiti art, for example, some of whom are now famous artists, for example, Banksy. But there is still a long way to go before the associations with willful negativity are erased from our consciousnesses. So here's examples of some conflicting images related to the term vandalism. Below is an abandoned house with its windows smashed and boarded up to prevent further damage being done inside. So that's one image that we come to. The other one is this is Israeli occupation walls on the West Bank, Palestine, but that have been enlivened by local artist murals. That's murals by local artists. So apart from the vandalism in the true sense of dividing indigenous communities apart by such concrete monstrosities, one can argue that this sort of graffiti not only makes an intolerable, otherwise intolerable situation slightly more bearable, but it also inspires resistance to it. So you can see that in the image above. To ask who the original Vandals were and whether they deserve such denigration, we overlap a bit with the previous term, barbarism. The Vandals were a Germanic group of tribes or peoples who originated in Scandinavia. We can see that the cursor there up at the top in orange. That was their original home. And they settled initially in Eastern Europe. We can see that over in red and yellow as they moved. And then they moved to the borders of the Roman Empire. There's still not a huge amount of violence or destructive activity at this point, if in fact at all. They were actually settled on the borders of the Roman Empire for a long time and had amicable arrangements with the Romans. And then they finally moved up along. This is probably propelled by the Huns coming in from the east. They moved up up this way towards the Rhine, and then they moved into the Roman Empire. So they crossed the Rhine into the Western Roman Empire, on into the Iberian Peninsula, and finally over to North Africa, where they were eventually subdued by the Eastern Romans or Byzantines in the 6th century Common Era. While the Vandals did acquire a reputation for looting and destruction when they entered the empire, we neglect how they had lived largely at peace with their neighbors for hundreds of years previous to that. We've already been talking about that. We also forget that the Roman authors who so reviled the Vandals came from a highly privileged stroke entitled class that was suffering the consequences of its imperial folly and needed some hapless outsider to blame for it. So the Vandals served a useful purpose, as it were. The late Roman Empire was an extortion racket, just as beset by marauding Roman armies as by barbarian ones. They were plundering as well. And evidence suggests that common people preferred the less onerous, freer life that they enjoyed under the so-called barbarians, including the Vandals. Right, we move on now to cynicism, another misused term. We all have this ideologized notion in our heads as to what a cynic is and what cynicism means. Once again, it's a specifically historically rooted term that has become shorn of its historicity and context. As it related initially to a philosophy associated with critical thinking, honesty, and virtue, we need to ask the question how and why this inverted meaning has occurred. People nowadays speak in contradiction of history if they refer to the actions of, say, a politician known for manipulation and callousness as being cynical. The irony is that the cynic philosophers of antiquity would have exposed such cynical behavior as an example of how base, immoral, and corrupt society at large was. The confusion of meaning stems from the later 19th century, where the term cynical was first used in psychology to apply to a norm of thinking that is related to psychiatry, related to pessimism. And from there, it was applied to social and legal contexts with inverted results. We can see this is the classic example of cynicism as we perceive it in the modern day. We have one example there, Silvio Berlusconi, deceased of Italy's Forza Italia. He's one of the many political epitomes of our time that exemplify the current meaning of the term cynical. But the original philosophers who were referred to as cynics were, in fact, followers of Socrates, who took their name from either the fact that the school that was first associated with them was the gymnasium of Kynosarges in Athens, and or that they adopted the symbol of the dog as dog being I think it's cynos or kainos in Greek, as an example of how people should live their lives and achieve happiness. The much better known and respectable Stoic school, in fact, later it grew out of the Cynic one. So the Cynics disdained all wealth and status. And in particular, they despised the hypocrisies and social pretensions of so-called civilized living. They preferred instead to live a natural life, like a dog, wearing very basic clothes, often living on the streets, and honest in their eyes and devoid of shame. So that means they perform natural acts wherever they felt the urge to do them, rather than hiding it away. Its most famous practitioner was Diogenes of Sinope, who famously lived in a barrel on the streets of Athens and engaged in confrontational publicity stunts that we'd consider today to be, if they were performed today, we'd consider them to be surrealist, Dadaist, or even situationist. Cynics bore some parallels to Buddhist hermits, Indian sadhus, and also the early Christians. And some have speculated that early Christianity grew out of a Galilean, that means in terms of not Galileo, but in terms of the Sea of Galilee region, fusion between Jewish asceticism and Greek cynicism. Cynics were also by nature troublemakers, and a few were even executed for annoying the authorities too much. The majority held heretical views on many subjects that the ancients would have found problematic, such as they promoted the basic human equality of slaves and women. Diogenes, so in the pictures we have at the top, we have Diogenes of Sinope, and he's searching with a lantern in broad daylight for the honest man. This is an example of the surrealist, provocative acts that he engaged in. Hipparchia is at the bottom. She was female, cynic philosopher. She's the one that we have, the only one that we have records of. That we know that there were others. She's the only one that is mentioned in the compilations of philosophers of the period. She lived on the streets of Athens with her lover Crates. You can see him on the left and her on the right. Apparently, what happened was that they met up, and he was a philosopher himself, cynic philosopher, and she said, "Am I going to have to devote the rest of my life?" She was a young woman at this point. Am I going to have to devote the rest of my life to working on a loom? And he said, "Not if you join me on the streets and become a philosopher." So she did that, which was quite a big thing for a woman to do at that time. They even had children together. The problem that arises in cynicism is multifaceted. On one level, we have a legitimate case for being used in psychology in relation to certain conditions if used ahistorically, if we acknowledge that, and on another, applied historically in the context of the development of our critical faculties, or to see through bullshit, basically. Either makes sense in its own way, but the conventional understanding and use of the term is both ahistorical and counterproductive to us making any progress in our contemporary social development as a species. So we have to question why and how this modern day interpretation has become the dominant one. Is it simply an accident of history, or is it something more ideological than that? While the subject needs some further investigation, it's likely that in the Western tradition that we have been conditioned to prioritize the Platonic and Aristotelian schools of philosophy against those of their contemporary rivals. Now, why is that? The former schools elevate the idealist, classist, and statist hierarchical concepts of the elites over the more basic, raw, and elementary or liberational elements of the other schools of philosophy which have been forgotten, such as cynicism. Perhaps the last word in the subject should go to George Bernard Shaw. You can see him pictured on the right. who argued the power of accurate observation is commonly called cynicism by those who don't have it. So we move on to our next term, which is Machiavellian. We continue to another term that we are all familiar with in the negativized sense of the other terms, and one which is also related to how we're conditioned to view cynicism as outlined above. This, however, is focused on a single individual who was quite extraordinary even for his own times, a 15th to 16th century Renaissance man, as they would have called him, from Florence, Italy, by the name of Niccolò Machiavelli. You'll see him pictured there on the left. The common usage of the term Machiavellian derives from a singular political work of his called The Prince, or Il Principio, I think it would be in Italian, purportedly addressed to the aspiring Florentine plutocrat of the period, Lorenzo de' Medici, as advice to how an unnamed but future prince, this is an important term, might order the affairs of state. The book is quite shockingly blunt in its advice, endorsing, for example, the complete elimination of all possible rivals through smears, blackmail, bribery, threats, and outright murder/massacre. The book was not published until 1532, so that was I think it was finished around about 1527, 5 years after the death of its author, and was condemned and damned by the church as a manual of pure evil. It's not known what Lorenzo de' Medici thought, but he certainly refused to allow its publication. The problem with the condemnation that the prince has received over the centuries is that its apparent amoral callousness does not exactly tie with what we know about the author's life. He was born to a prosperous citizen family in Florence in 1469, at a time when the city was a republic, but one that was being constantly undermined by competing noble families, the de Medicis being one of them, with autocratic tendencies, and also by fickle bands of mercenary condottieri who were dabbling maliciously in civic politics. Contrary to what we might expect from the author of The Prince, however, it is known that while holding the actual office of policy advisor, which he held for a period, I think earlier on, he didn't hold it at this period when he was writing, Machiavelli was he was known as being a committed, principled Republican who fought vigorously against the aforesaid corruptions that we have just outlined. So there's a contradiction there. His period of exile from the city, he retired to the country, probably to save his life before they killed him, in fact, began with the rise of the de' Medici family. Above, we can see a 16th century woodcut of the city of Florence. We also must consider his other works, which stretched from poetry and plays to other writings on politics, that have left a quite different flavor such as discourses on Livy, a less famous but more considered critique and endorsement of the Roman Republic. But in his time, he was actually a lot more famous for his dramas. Much loved, apparently, comedies and satires based on Hellenistic period rustic romps. So one needs to question, what exactly was Machiavelli's intention with the prince, and whether he is being correctly reviled for writing an evil book, or perhaps analyzing it in the vein of what we actually know about the man, that he was a Republican with fine honed skills in the art of sometimes dark satire and mockery. This was certainly the opinion of Rousseau, amongst others, more recent, and it is worth pointing out that the central character in one of his popular ribald comedies of the period was a woman called Lucrezia. And Lucrezia was also the name of one of the most hated figures, though perhaps unjustly, subject for another discussion, of the de Borgia family dynasty at the time. Whatever Machiavelli's real intentions were, we are left in no doubt that he was skeptical about religion and the authority of the church. He's sometimes seen as the world's first modernist. We can also speculate as to whom he was really addressing as the future prince. Or if he'd intended it for a single person, then why did he pitch it as a book to go out for general release and general public consumption? So opposite, we can see a map of the various principalities and republics of Italy that existed during the Italian Wars period that Machiavelli lived in. These wars were complicated by opportunist interventions, as well as the local rivalries. There were also opportunist interventions by French, Austrian, and Spanish imperial kingdoms. We now move to another term that is in use called amok, similar to the term. Another term is not related to amok, but it's a similar vein of analysis could apply to the word thug, for instance, which derives from thuggee in Indian religion. The term amok differs from the other terms that we've been examining in that today it's been trivialized almost beyond recognition, usually referring to the mundane rampages of a child, a mechanical toy, or even a housebound pet. Originally, however, it related to the interaction of Europeans' colonialism with the societies in Malaya and Indonesia. The rational Europeans were perplexed as to how crazed homicidal behavior would apparently suddenly and unpredictably explode amongst the people who otherwise appeared to be, to the colonialists, act in a most helpful, welcoming, and submissive manner, at least according to the Western Orientalist stereotypes that were dominant at the time. Typical of these accounts is that of British imperialist stroke explorer James Cook, who opined that whenever drunken opium some random lone villager would start hacking away at all in sight, usually with a machete, until either killed or restrained by the wider community. You can see an image there, obviously created in the West, of Captain Cook's arrival in Malaya, 1770, typical Orientalist picture. Naturally, in the eyes of Cook and his fellow colonialist pioneers, this sort of behavior was just proof as to the irrationality and unpredictability of a people who inherently lacked the power of reason, and, well, of course, they would have to be ruled by others who did. So when the disciples of psychology and anthropology, the disciplines of psychology and anthropology developed in the late 19th century, a considerable amount of effort was expended on trying to find a root cause of this worrying behavior. They found that it was not a universal amongst all colonized people, and they speculated that it was something to do with maybe a perceived loss of honor amongst males for a variety of reasons, not including colonialism, of course, and provoking these reactions would have been akin to suicide in other cultures, but instead in these cultures manifested as a murderous rampage. They also were told by their respondents, for various reasons that we should examine, but not here, that the cause was possession by an evil tiger spirit known as a Hantu Belian. More recent investigation has brought to light that amok, in fact, originated in the indigenous word for the warrior class, to whom in pre-colonial times such behavior was occasionally warranted, whenever a king was killed in battle and had to be avenged by his personal following. This makes it likely that Western imperials were largely instrumental in making the facts, as they experienced them in reality, fit a pre-existing racist theory. So one has to ask the question, did they in fact, for the most part, make it all up? So we can see a typical Orientalist picture there on the right, showing examples of the local people in case other explorers would encounter them. The Malay man and woman depicted in the manner that we would expect for a colonial inventory of native peoples. Other studies and new evidence have also emerged since to show that such behavior, even if it did occur with the alleged frequency and randomness that colonial administrations imagined it did in Malaya and Indonesia, is certainly not restricted to peoples or cultures in the so-called Orient. For example, there is the medieval Nordic tradition of berserkir, not to mention the incel subculture that has developed in the West, in particular, in fact, in its most advanced member, the United States, involving mass shootings in malls, schools, and at public events. It seems that those Malays / Indonesians who did succumb to the rage of amok, if they ever did, are no longer alone. We are still trying to explain and prevent such horrifying phenomena. Yet, just as in colonial Malaya, are we are we, this is a question, are we ready to question ourselves? Particularly in the context of the West's long history of endemic social violence and the commodity culture related to it, which is with its dehumanizing atomization of the individual. So we can see the Columbine massacre. It was one of the first mass shootings in the USA, dated April 1999. There was actually a previous one, I think in 1966 or something, but it wasn't since the Columbine one. It has become a sort of generic thing. One more or less happens every year or so. The 1960s one was relatively isolated. Right, we move on to Luddite. This is our last term. The final term we'll explore is one that's still much in misuse today, Luddite. In common conversation, how this term usually arises in general speak is in a technocratic attempt to explain away anti-technological, as they put it, or anti-improvement, as they put it, behavior experienced from the perception of the introducers of such technological wonders. Implicit in the use of the term is that those resisting the changes are backwards, stupid, surly, irrational, violent, and absurd. Sound familiar? Do those who casually throw the term Luddite around have any historical knowledge as to where it arose and why? Do they even know who Ned Ludd was? Or in fact, probably wasn't, for example? Usually they do not. So Ned, or sometimes he's referred to as King Ludd, was a semi-mythological figure who is supposed to have smashed two mechanical looms at the same time, circa 1780, so that's before the period we're talking about, in a rapidly industrializing England. And where there was an attempt by the textile industry magnates to introduce mechanical looms that would simplify the skilled labor of hand looms and hence not improve the product of the quality of the product, but would improve profits by making the craftsmen who are making the skilled and quality products redundant and reducing pay for what was going to be reduced to a suddenly vulnerable, undifferentiated mass of casual labor. Over there on the left, we can see a contemporary illustration. So there, the Luddites engaged in their destruction and burning, and the chief Luddite pictured there is in women's clothing, which was actually a feature of the time. We'll talk about that coming up. The Luddites reacted to this threat to their livelihoods and families by writing warnings to mill owners and allied government legislators, bringing in these changes. And when these didn't work, then they started breaking and smashing machines, breaking into the factories, committing acts of arsons on occasion, and on one occasion in particular, and assassination, just one. The name of Ned stroke King Lud was signed on all letters they sent and the propaganda they distributed. The Luddite crowds often operated at night, sometimes dressed in women's clothing or similar disguise. The historian Eric Hobsbawm, famous English historian, described their actions as a form of collective bargaining by riot. We can see an image from there on the right of them smashing the machines in the mass production factories or mills. Luddism lasted from approximately 1811 to 16, starting in Nottinghamshire and quickly spreading to other places such as South Yorkshire, Derbyshire, I think Cheshire as well, and certainly Lancashire. State terror followed, with mass arrests of weavers, often at random. So if you were just a weaver, you could be arrested, and with no evidence provided, this arrest could be followed with was generally followed by inevitable conviction, hanging, or transportation to the colonies as a indentured servant. Alone in Parliament, Lord Byron, he was the only person to speak out to defend the Luddites. He was obviously a lord, he wasn't an MP, but he spoke out in their defense. As testament to the level of self-organization by workers involved and the seriousness with which the elites felt their power to be under threat, we know that even while they were engaged in a Europe-wide war with Napoleon, the British government dispatched 12,000 regular soldiers to the areas where the Luddites were operating. So afraid were they of these clandestine bands fomenting a revolution. And this number was more than the total troops they dispatched simultaneously to the Duke of Wellington for the what's the word, conduct of the Peninsular War, which was essential to defeating Napoleon. So what was going on there? Recently, a new term has arisen, known to technocrats and to those who stand to make profits out of the new technology concerned, as neo-Luddism. This is another catch-all slur to take in everyone from neo-primitivists to workers who, once again, in a neoliberal world order, are just disposable commodities, and who are likely to have their livelihoods destroyed by AI or other wondrous future advances, introduced without a thought, of course, to and at the expense of the vast majority of people and, incidentally, the survival of the planet. As yet, neo-Luddism has yet to develop its forms of struggle, as it needs to be able to transcend the automated globalization of world finance and the plutocratic ambitions of big tech. At present, neo-Luddism is merely a theory, and one could say that it's a predictive theory because there are very few concrete examples as yet, unmarked by correspondences in real life. If it does develop, however, the working class will, as before, once again astound all and prove its indomitable creativity and its resilience to the demands of capital. So we can see over here on the left a cartoon of neo-Luddites engaged in rather unlikely stroke anachronistic acts of sabotage and revolt, their leader mimicking the pose of the famous 19th century Luddite caricature that we were previously looking at. That's the end of the discussion. Thank you very much.